Welcome everyone to the Junior League of Bergen County's Unity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Allyship webinar, a community conversation on the importance of equality. I am Britt Erica Tunick, President of the Junior League of Bergen County, and we are glad you are able to join us this evening for a discussion that is, unfortunately, as necessary today as it was 100 years ago. Now I'd just like to quickly introduce this evening's speakers. Deborah Gustin is an attorney focused on family formation through adoption and assisted reproduction and family protection through guardianship, estate planning, probate, and special needs trusts. She has been an advocate for LGBTQIA+ rights in New Jersey for over 30 years and has helped write several important laws and legislative advocacy in the family formation area. She is a past president of ACLU New Jersey and a past president and the current adoption director of the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproduction Attorneys, where she guides this international organization of credentialed attorneys' adoption policy work. Nadia Hussein works for Moms Rising, where she directs their maternal justice campaign, which encompasses maternal health, mass incarceration reform, and police reform work. She serves on the National Board of Directors of the ACLU, as the Board of Trustees of the ACLU NJ Board. She is also the co-founder of the Bangladeshi American Women's Development Initiative, a community initiative empowering Bangladeshi women and girls in New Jersey. Rashidi Isigli is a talent acquisition professional with nearly 20 years of experience across several industries, including fashion, sports, technology, startups, and banking. In her current role, she is a senior manager of talent acquisition for Richmond, North America, where she is responsible for retail and corporate recruitment. Before joining Richmond, North America, she was a manager of recruitment for the National Basketball Association. She has made it her mission to build community relationships with universities and organizations to create a pipeline of diverse talent pools. And this evening's moderator is Reverend Bruce Ballantyne, who is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. During the past 26 years, he has served congregations in Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. For a number of those years, he worked in transitional ministry, assisting congregations through seasons of change. He is currently pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Ridgewood. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Bruce.
In similar conversations offline is that we will find comfort in the places where we overlap, as Ani DeFranco has said. But we will also find allies around the issues that matter to us. With that said, I'll start off with this question for each of our panelists. What are the major issues facing your community or communities, as the case may be? Nadia, would you mind answering that one first?
Sure. No, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Britt, for organizing this. I think for me, community is always so self-identified, right? It could be the community you live in, maybe ethnically, maybe an ethnic community you identify with, a religious community. So when I say community, I'm just going to kind of self-identify that. As Britt mentioned, I'm co-founder of the Bangladeshi American Women's Development Initiative, and a lot of our work, even though it is statewide, is focused on Patterson. Patterson has a very big Bangladeshi American community, and during the pandemic, we were doing a rapid relief donations and funds for the community, a big fundraiser to help with COVID. And one thing we kept hearing over and over again were that people had lost jobs. The economic impact on our community is very strong, that a lot of community members had lost parents or had been sick, maybe in the hospital for a month because of COVID, and subsequently lost their jobs. Our community also has undocumented folks and who are very much underground, and oftentimes their own community members might not be undocumented. And the challenges for COVID was even greater for them in terms of sometimes they under the table. They worked in stores doing cashier work. Now with so many businesses being closed, that was just not available to them. So the economic impact was definitely felt, and the health impact was felt. So many community members live in multi-generational households. They live in apartments with a lot of people in an apartment building that has many different levels. So you definitely saw COVID really go through the community really go through and impact the community in a disproportionate way? Sorry, Bruce, you're still muted. You might, yeah.
Rashida, would you like to take a crack at that one? What are the major issues facing your community?
I mean, I think that there's a lot that's going on within, I guess, the Black and Brown community right now. I personally identify as, first generation African American, whose parents immigrated from Africa. I think overarching, there's a lot that's going on, and it's really hard to kind of focus on one particular thing to help kind of move and advance some of the challenges that we have. I think what's been great from a corporate standpoint, and I say this just because I'm coming from an HR perspective, is that there are a number of organizations that have really had an opportunity to say, hey, listen, like, we hear you, we see what's going on, we're going to do some active work to start trying to change that. But I think the overall challenge is that a lot of this has been, really systematic, and it's something that's going to take a long time, I think, in my personal opinion, to change. And so how do we start to change people's, feelings when they're not really even aware of how they might show up in terms of their bias, regardless of the degree. And I think it's a matter of really being able to come and have a meeting of the minds to just say, we realize that we have a problem. It's less about placing blame, but how do we start to change this behavior in a way that really gives people an opportune platform to advance and whatever, whether it be socially, within the workplace, just in the day-to-day. And I think we're kind of challenged in how we just have people start to like really listen and not take offense or defense to start trying to move things forward.
Thank you, Rashida. Deborah, would you like to answer that one? What are the major issues facing your communities?
So I think it's a really interesting question for the LGBTQ plus community, because we are by far not a monolithic community. And I think, as you can see from the flag image behind me, there are so many different communities that comprise the community that I'm here to talk about tonight. So I think if I had to identify one thing that I think is most difficult right now, is the fact that because we can't gather, there are young people who are questioning their gender identity, their sexual orientation, or anything else about themselves, who cannot seek out each other's comfort. They can't seek out communities and adults who are affirming of them, and in a community that has a need to connect and a need to be in social spaces together to provide affirmation. This entire COVID has certainly created significant problems for people. And I think our community is very concerned about those issues. And as I mentioned, as I started, I think the intersectionality of all of our, of all of the people who identify as LGBTQ+, brings in everything that Rashida was talking about, everything that Nadia was talking about, because we're just such a diverse community within that definition of a community.
That's great. I think the next question, I'll just stick with you, Deborah. What does inclusion look like in your space? And how do we avoid tokenism and ensure that we invest in and uplift diverse leadership?
Well, that's a really hard question for the LGBT community. Because we are so diverse, there are not a whole lot of spaces that I've ever experienced where all of that diversity has come together. And just like any other community, whether it's a religious community or whether it's a municipal community, a school community, there still tends to be, I think, a congregation of like-minded and culturally minded people. People gather and together with people with whom they're familiar with. One of the things, again, this kind of goes back to my comment about COVID, is that inclusion is really hard when you cannot meet and when you cannot exchange ideas in person. Technology is a great way to get together like this is, but we're not going to get to know each other as well as we could if we were seated in the same room together. And again, for tokenism, it's really hard. How do you pick, if you're trying to form a community and you say, well, really want someone from the LGBTQ community here? Well, gay men are very different sometimes than lesbians are, and transgender people have an entirely different life experience. And the difference between trans men and trans women is entirely different experience. So trying to say, I want someone from this community to participate, you're going to get an individual. You're not going to get someone who's going to be able to speak significantly to a broad range of experience. So that's a very difficult thing in respect to my community.
Thank you, Deborah. Rashida, what does inclusion look like in your space?
I think to Deb's point, I think it is definitely a very complicated question. And I think on the broader spectrum, when I'm speaking with decision makers about how do we define diversity, what does that look and feel like, it's difficult because you don't want people to be a token. So when I'm looking from an organizational standpoint, it's one thing to get diverse talent into the door, but it's another thing to be able to retain that talent. And retaining the talent is really, to me, where the kind of inclusion and the belonging really starts. So how integrated does that person feel in the day-to-day? Does that person have the same level of investment from senior leaders or mentors, and really helping to kind of navigate the landscape for whatever, whether it be based on the department or the greater organization, but are they having people that are doing that outreach and really kind of making that investment in them as an individual, and truly kind of believe in the fact that they do have a place there. I think it's a really, really difficult question. I know for, even within the Black community, you have, Afro-Latina, you have, first generation Africans, you have African American, you have so many different layers to Deb's point. We're not monolithic. So we have so many different layers as to people's, how people identify, whether that be on their skin color or where they come from. It's just difficult. I think at the end of the day, regardless of how someone identifies, I think the common theme should just be that we're looking at people as individuals and what they're able to bring to the table, but that we also need to make sure that there should be different voices. So people should probably look a little bit different and come from different backgrounds. Sure. But I think it's something, I don't know anyone that has the answer for it right now, but I think just putting forth the effort and having these type of community conversations is a really good step.
Great. And Nadia, would you like to respond to that? What does inclusion look like in your community?
Well, I think, I think for inclusion, Deb had referred to it earlier, when you're building a community or a leadership group or whatever have you, some kind of group of folks, saying we would like to have an LGBTQ person, for example, can look like so many different things, right? And she mentioned the transgender experience. I do think that starting from a point of prioritizing inclusion is very important. It's not always going to look perfect. We're always learning, but I really believe that if you're starting from a place of openness, of valuing and prioritizing inclusion, and coming from a place of humility and wanting to learn and being open to getting educated, being open to learning through that experience and taking feedback without getting offended or taking feedback without taking it personally, that's a really good place to start. And when we do get folks from different, whether it be sexual orientation, gender orientation, religious backgrounds, different self-identified backgrounds, once we're in positions in a group, on a board, in a community, it's really also important to be intentional about making leadership opportunities available, really lifting up somebody into leadership positions. Too often, what happens is we do see folks, maybe like people of color or people from diverse backgrounds coming onto a board, and what makes something a token? It's when having them on gives you that check and you're good. Now that's not good, because that's not empowering, and that's not engaging, and that's really not being inclusive. That's just checking a box. Being inclusive means being mindful about how can we grow leadership. How can, if someone new joined your board who is a person of color, who is a community you haven't engaged with before, is there a way to facilitate leadership opportunities or leadership training, or a way to engage that person, either meeting them where they're at, and also and showing that person that you do value them, that it's not just a box that you're checking. I will say I've been in places, and I will say I'm very lucky when I've actually been asked to be in leadership positions, and I could have said no or yes. I mean, of course, it's based on comfort level. Sometimes that needs to be cultivated. It's just not a given. But for me, I was ready. I wanted to be in those leadership positions. So when I had that opportunity, I took advantage of it, but I also was lifted up by other people who were there already, who did value inclusivity. And so that was really important to me. So for anybody who's listening and that's something you want to do, just, I think being open, honest, taking the steps to actually uplift leadership and open up leadership roles to diverse communities and diverse backgrounds is very important. Another thing that's also important is that once we're in these leadership positions, ensuring that we stay on. Oftentimes what we see is a retention issue, right? That maybe we want someone from this community and maybe they keep leaving the board, or maybe they keep not engaging, and too often it's like, oh, well, they just weren't interested. Well, that's the easy answer. What's a little bit more complicated, or what asks more of us, is to create spaces that ensures that people feel safe and supported to stay on and grow their own leadership journey. So that to me is how tokenism can be addressed, and it doesn't need to be. Tokenism doesn't need to be the standard for how we include diversity in our spaces.
Creating space to allow people to fully engage, and then if they withdraw, maybe talk to them and find out why. What could we have done differently? Thank you. Deborah, the LGBTQIA plus community, as you've already alluded to, is itself a very diverse community. How does such a diverse community address needs and problems?
Well, I think that one of the things that I do when I do cultural competency training about LGBTQI people is I have to remind people that this identity is oftentimes not seen. I'm a white person. I also identify as lesbian. I also identify as female. I was raised in a conservative Jewish tradition, and I identify as Jewish. But a lot of those things that I just told you about myself aren't necessarily something that if you just saw me walking down the block, you're going to say, oh, that's one of those things. And so I think that our community, as in my work in the LGBTQ plus community, is really a matter of first saying that people, and I think Rashida said this at first, is first recognizing that people have the right to define themselves any way they want to define themselves. It's not anybody else's job to figure out how I should or could define myself. So that's, I think, how we start within a very diverse community, is recognizing that we may have a commonality, but we may only have one commonality. We have to figure out then I use the term intersectionality, and I think it's really important to understand that people can be disadvantaged in our society on a whole range of identity issues, so that within the LGBTQ plus community, there are people who feel that they're left out because they are a person of color. They may feel left out because they have a different class status. There are people who may feel left out because they are a member of a disability community. So there's such a need to just create spaces where people can be free to exchange conversation about who they are, and have an ability to understand that just because there's one classification doesn't necessarily mean that there is commonality on you do have to work at it. I think as Rashida and Nadia have said, this takes work. And it takes work to figure out how people fit into such a huge, huge community. And again, Nadia and Rashida have talked about workspaces and board spaces, but this is exactly the same in a social space, in any kind of communal space, is it takes work and it takes openness, and we're all going to make big mistakes, but we just have to take it with a smile and apologize if we've made a mistake, and feel free to explain ourselves, because the only way we get to move beyond these differences is if we all take responsibility, not only for being open to other people, but to be open about ourselves.
Thank you, Deborah. Nadia and Rashida, your communities are not monolithic communities either. Would either or both of you like to discuss intersectionality?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, Rashida, is it okay if I go? Oh, yeah, I didn't want to interrupt anybody. Exactly. Nobody, I don't think anybody's monolithic, right? I mean, we all come from very different, we all come from our own experiences and backgrounds, and we don't always know someone's story just by looking at their face or how we see them as presenting themselves without them telling us what their story is. For the Bangladeshi community, for example, there are classism is a very big issue in our community, for folks of different income levels, and that background, access to education, socioeconomic status. I mean, obviously that's true for any community, but in our community, it really makes an impact. For example, with Asian Americans, South Asian Americans, there's this model minority myth, the feeling that, oh, well, if you're Indian or you're all seen as Indian or you come from the South Asian subcontinent, that you're all doctors, lawyers, and everything's great. You get high SAT scores, you go to good colleges, and sometimes our community embraces that. It's about keeping up with the Joneses. It can be about seeing white supremacy as something that is advantageous to us when actually it's the opposite. And for the Bangladeshi community, the model minority actually does us a lot of disfavor, because across the board, Bangladeshi community doesn't have the same income level. If you look at, compared to the Indian American community, our health markers are poorer and lower. So when it comes to things like, even if you're working as an organization getting governmental grants or uplifting the stories in your community, sometimes it's like, oh, well, your community doesn't have problems, you're fine. And that's, again, it paints such an incomplete story, and actually it's a very dangerous narrative that can even cost lives. For example, mental health issues in our community, the stigma of mental health, the stigma of reporting sexual assaults or sexual abuse in families. I mean, these are all things that when everything looks, you want it just to keep everything perfect, there's a lot of fissures underneath, right? And it can be really harmful for our community. And other intersections I'd love to uplift are also, for example, I mentioned earlier that we have undocumented Bangladeshis as well in Patterson and New York City. And so when we see attacks on immigrant communities, that includes our community as well. And so when we do work, it is work uplifting other immigrant communities, Latino communities, for example, working together with those communities, because we recognize that if our community our communities just work in silos, then we actually we don't build up our people power. We actually fall within division. I also wanted to uplift that one of the things that Bowdy, my organization, has done is really stand with Black Lives Matter. And this has not been new for us. This is something, as soon as we started, it was very intentional that we wanted to be there in solidarity with Black lives. As soon as we began 5 years ago, we attended Black Lives Matter meetings that were open to the public, made sure we shared or retweeted or invited folks to marches, and we're just present whenever they asked us to be. And also, things like calling for police reform, right? I mean, police reform, it disproportionately impacts Black communities, but too often, communities of color, immigrant communities, also face a disproportionate brutality by police forces. So intersectionality is very important, because it's very important to bring down the barriers that we think exist. But I think it's also important to be unified, to bring unity. But I think it's also important to recognize when there are disparities, right? That anti-Black racism looks very different than other types of racism, and so within that, also listening and recognizing that we can be intersectional without minimizing actual experiences that certain communities face.
Thank you. Rashida, would you like to address intersectionality?
No, absolutely. I think Deb and Nadia did an amazing job at just kind of really talking about how we're, for the lack of the better term, how we're not monolithic. And, for me and in my community as an African-American woman, I find that even just within our own community, colorism is something that still is very strong. We still have bleaching, we still have our own sense of like a caste system. Like there's still a lot of things that play into how we identify, not just within each other, but also outward looking, with other ethnicities, based on our skin tone. And so we have our own kind of issues that almost still plague us. And so from the outside, it's really easy to almost kind of create certain divides in classism. And how do we do that? And how do we have, when we're looking at like Black Lives Matter, it's not all one voice. Like I know a lot of Black people that have a lot of really different interpretations and feelings about what this is, and it's not just all one tone. And so how do we find kind of a common ground? And I think it's really difficult. I think at the end of the day, I think what people want most, regardless of how you identify, is to be treated fairly. Equal rights to housing, equal rights to employment, equal opportunities for for education, to really have a platform to be able to grow and prosper. And so we're seeing a lot of things, I think, kind of in the last 6 months or so, that are really showcasing, and really more so on social media, and through video, how a lot of the systematic kind of oppression really works. And a lot of people, I think, are really surprised because they've heard the language, but they haven't really seen the actions that go along with this and how this functions in kind of a day-to-day. So, I think it's a big body of work, but I think it's having these conversations, talking to people that look different, hearing people's different stories, because my experience as a Black woman is going to be different than my sister's experience as a Black woman. And we're each going to have our own journey, but we also have our own story that also has the opportunity and has the right to be heard, and be considered when we're having conversations, regardless of how you identify. And so for me, it's really about not seeing color, but really being more focused on just making sure that we're not oppressing and we're not inhibiting one's right to have a good life. Like, to me, that's really the root of it. Like, just don't do bad stuff. Like, make sure that people have an opportunity to be heard, have a seat at the table, and that if they're discounted, that it's not based on how they identify. Let it be based on qualifications. So I think it's just a really big conversation, but I just think that doing things like these and having these community conversations, I think, are so incredibly important, because I think in no other circumstance or situation, outside of this forum, do I think I would have ended up with anyone? And, you know, anyone that's on this Zoom call right now, which is a great thing. I hope somehow we're able to kind of stay connected in some sort of social media forum, but it's things like this that bring different people together and gatherings that they otherwise would not have had the opportunity or the initiative to take. So I'm just thankful to be here.
Oh. Yeah, I think we're all thankful to be here. Rashida, I have another question that you may want to address. COVID-19 is challenging all of us in unprecedented ways. But how these challenges are experienced, well, they're impacting communities of color in disproportionate ways. How can we serve as allies in solidarity with Black people and other communities of color?
I mean, I think healthcare outside of COVID has been a big issue. I think a lot of what I've been reading and watching have been individual stories, like for Black women specifically, through childbirth, and then also just family members that I'm close with that have had different experiences when they thought that they might have had COVID and ended up did having COVID, but what their journey had to be to push. You know, I think when we look at some of the origins of medicine throughout the world, but even more so within, you know, the United States, like Black women specifically were operated on without anesthesia because it was thought that we didn't have the same level of the same pain threshold. You look at, I was watching something else where they were talking about as doctors, when you're looking at, it was a show I was watching, they were talking about as doctors, when you're looking in textbooks, all you see as it pertains to a rash is a rash on someone who is Caucasian. So if you're looking at someone that has a different complexion or a different skin tone and they have a rash, you might not catch it because that's not the way you were taught to identify it. So there's some really, really deep systemic kind of issues with how I think healthcare is managed in current state through insurance, through wealth, through social class, but then also just how you know, practitioners just in general are being taught to kind of administer and kind of practice within our current state, and it truly really hurts us. You know, the personal story that I'll share as it relates to COVID is I have somebody who's, you know, what I consider immediate family. They had some, you know, probably some symptoms, but they were, you know, a fever was one of them, aches, pain, not being able to taste. And this person went to their general practitioner. It's not someone who goes to their doctor often outside of their annual visit, and said, I think that I might have COVID, like these are my signs. And this was in the early stages of COVID, where you had to get a prescription essentially to be tested. This individual had to go back to their doctor 3 times. They had to call and dispute it 3 times to request and insist that I'm not someone who's a chronic, pain management user. I'm not someone who comes in often outside of my heart, you know, because then there's also the predisposition, right, that they have outside of their heart medication or blood pressure medication. They're not using any other medications. And so they're not crying wolf. And the fact that they had to fight and really have 3 separate conversations to get the prescription written so they can go and get tested. And this is someone who's in their, you know, mid 60s. And then they tested positive, is just a prime example of how we're not advocating. And so it's important for, I think, us just in general, when we talk about advocacy and we talk about action, is to really question, why are you discounting someone's experience just because you might not identify with it? And we need to be asking that at every level of our practitioners, of our friends, of our loved ones, of our employers, of people within our affiliations, whether it be through, you know, church or social membership. We really need to be pushing people when we hear things to just ask, like, you know, what is it that you think makes you feel this way? Outside of the color of this person's skin, I think anyone would have raised the level as, this is probably something that we need to take a look into further. And given that they are in a risk space in terms of having a predisposed position, I could very easily see how if that person hasn't fought, how they very easily could have ended up as one of the over 100,000 people right now that's passed due to COVID, just because of lack of attention and diagnosis.
Thank you for sharing that story. That should never happen. Nadia, would you like to address that as well? How can we serve as allies in solidarity with Black people and other communities of color?
I always say this, I feel like humility goes a long way. Being open to learn, being open to being wrong sometimes, but it's not about never making mistakes. It's never about, I think it's not about never making mistakes or always saying the right thing, but I think it's important to learn from any mistakes that anybody makes, and just know that that's important, that it's better to engage and learn and move forward like that, rather than being comfortable in not knowing, being comfortable in not engaging. You know, with our, and I really want to thank Rashida for just sharing some of the statistics she shared. One of the things I work on is maternal health, and Black women die at 3 or 4 times the rate that white women do. And in New Jersey, it's actually a little higher. It's we actually have a higher death rate for Black moms than the national average. And even with COVID, the outcomes for Black people, I believe they've died at twice the rate. For Hispanic people, it's been worse. And the economic downturn due to COVID has hit, of any group, I believe Hispanic women the worst, Latinx, Latin identified women the worst. And so, you know, what does it look like to be an ally? Well, oftentimes being an ally means having some privilege. And, you know, having some privilege is not something you need to necessarily feel guilty about, but it's like, what do we do? And it's not just white privilege. I have privilege. I have access to education. I have U.S. citizenship. I live in a house in a suburban neighborhood, right? Like there's privilege can look like lots of different things, but you knowing that you have that, like recognize, okay, yeah, I do have this privilege, but what can I do with this privilege? What can I do to better my community? You know, take and make an impact on social justice or value human rights. Like, what could I do? What could I do with that privilege? And sometimes that means that, you know, I can stand up for somebody who's being targeted because I know they're not going to come after me, right? Because I might have my white privilege, or I might have this economic privilege. It's not the same as how we're going into a community and trying to fix those problems. That looks very different. But I think working from a place where you could be of assistance or even of help to a community by just kind of standing in a way that's not available to everybody. So for example, I always think this is a very powerful example. In California, there was, and this was before George Floyd, there was an incident where a young Black man was unarmed, was shot and killed by the police. And his brother came to a city council meeting after that and got very emotional. Understandably, your family member was killed in cold blood by the police department, and they have children, and they were killed like outside the family home. And there was a fellow, I guess, there were organizers with him, and they were white organizers, and he got emotional, and I think he might have stood on a table or something like that, and police were coming to take him down. And what these white protesters did, they actually used their bodies to protect him. They literally stood in front. They didn't put their arms out. They weren't fighting. They were just doing, if anything, active resistance, right? But nothing. It was completely nonviolent. They were just standing there with their bodies because they knew that their white skin was protecting them, because his Black skin wasn't going to. I'm not saying that's the only way you can do that. That's one example, but I think it's a very powerful example, just something to think about of what really allyship looks like. But in other spaces, it looks like, you know, uplifting groups of people, uplifting organizations. In the Black maternal space, for example, we know that Black women are dying at disproportionate amounts of rates, but Black women organizations that have done this organizing work for years and years and years, they don't get the funding. They never get the funding. Why is that? When they have the relationships in the community, they are working on this issue already, they're living this issue, but they're not getting the funding. So often too often what we hear is lip service, and, you know, enough of lip service. We need actual service. So allyship also looks like It doesn't look like broken promises. It doesn't look like empty promises. It looks like friendship. It looks like showing up. It looks like learning. It looks like investing in the communities you say you care about and the differences you say you want to see.
Thank you, Nadia. Deb, would you like to address how COVID-19 is challenging your community?
Well, I wanted to loop back perhaps to some of the thoughts that Rashida and Nadia just shared, because one of the things that I'm seeing that I think is beginning to create this intersectionality between Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ community is I'm seeing more and more silence equals death postings, which is the statement that was made by early AIDS HIV advocates. The experience of the gay community in the late 1970s and 1980s, I think, is a great way for current activists to look at a healthcare crisis that's disproportionately hitting a particular group of people, and the need for all kinds of people to come together to say, no, enough is enough. We've got to fix these problems, because they're clearly, it's not just a virus, it's clearly systemic problems of access to care, of access to good care within certain communities. And not only access, but even if you have access, I remember Nadia sharing with me, we banged into each other in Trenton a couple of years ago, and she was testifying about some of her work. And some of what I heard too was that it really doesn't matter if you're an African-American woman of means, and whether you have good health insurance, you still have systemic problems that are creating issues with your accessing good maternal health. I'm seeing more and more the gay community trying to share some of those shared and those learned experiences of working through HIV/AIDS and the kinds of protests that were needed to get governmental action and to make changes systemically within the healthcare system. So I hope that that is a good shared experience that can bear some fruit here.
Thank you, Deb. And I would call everybody's attention to the Zoom group chat. Some excellent comments there that you don't want to miss. I have a question that I'd like each of you to address from your various perspectives. What resources would you suggest we might use to educate ourselves around these issues? Rashida, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. And I was actually going to piggyback a little bit more off of, what Deb had shared. I think, collectively, this is obviously a very monumental year for a number of different reasons, both good and bad. But I think social activism is one of those things that we cannot, and kind of civil responsibility in 2020 is something that we cannot ignore, regardless of how you identify. We had the census this year. We have a big voting opportunity this year throughout, the continental United States. And I think it's really, 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 really important that we are looking at the officials and the people that we have in place, and that we are taking an active stance on making sure that we show up, whether it be by mail-in ballot or in person, to vote. That level of activism in terms of understanding and not just voting based on party lines, and looking at the issues that are affecting not just our community, but things that are affecting just people's ability to live and thrive just in general as a basic human right. And so just because it doesn't sit at your doorstep doesn't mean that it's not something that you shouldn't pay attention to. I think we need to make sure that we all have the right opportunity to kind of live and prosper within this, what we call a democracy. And so I think for me, the biggest thing as it relates to activism right now is to, number one, engage on social media. So I'm a part of a number of different groups, whether it be on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, that might be communities that I don't necessarily identify with, but to understand the things that are happening and the things and the parts that I can play, and helping to make a difference is just basic knowledge and literacy and being current. And sometimes it can feel like overload. So, use your discretion. But at the same time, I need to be aware of the things that are happening, not just in the Black community, but in northern New Jersey, in the United States, on the East Coast, just in the current state of our universe. And we need to be able to do that in any way we feel if we don't have those personal people that look a little bit different to kind of help clue us in. But outreaching and just connecting outside of how you identify to really have and stay abreast of what's going on to really be able to start affecting change through knowledge.
Thank you, Rashida. Nadia, would you like to share what you think we might be able to do to better educate ourselves?
Rashida brings up some very important points. As we know, social media can be a boom or a bane for information and learning the things that we should be learning about. But there are still sources out there that are actual sources, that are research, that have that you can know who the author is, know where the facts came from, and if they do mess up the facts, they fact check and apologize. So social media is a good place to look at where the article is coming from. It's always really important to be a little discerning, but the internet is just a wealth of knowledge. And I think about how some of the things that I've learned. Yes, it's been, if there's an organization that you've heard about or that you're interested in, but maybe you're not involved with them, following them on Facebook, looking at the articles they post, the actions they post. Moms Rising, my organization that I work for, momsrising.org. We have a blog, we have blogs there. We work on multiple issues. We're a multi-issue organization. There's a lot of information there that people can engage and learn about. We're also on Facebook as well. But I did want to uplift, for example, I spoke about some Black maternal health background and issues. There's the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, BMMA. If you just Google Black Mamas Matter Alliance, they're on Twitter. They're very active on Instagram. They have wonderful resources on their page. If you ever refer to them, I definitely want to make sure that you identify them as the source if you ever utilize their information for something else. But they're great. They have a lot of fact-based information. They have reports that have been authored by wonderful activists and writers. So that's another place. Color Change is a national advocacy organization that has been really galvanized and working on a lot of these civil rights issues. So being on their mailing list, you can even the emails have articles in the bottom that they link to that they use as a referral source. So it's always important to get sources that are actual sources, that are verifiable sources for your information. And absolutely, it really can be overwhelming. It can be like drinking out of a fire hose a little bit, but it's also about what are you interested in? What strikes a passion in your heart? What is something that you can you want to make a difference on, or you just want to learn more about? Those are all points you can start from. And there definitely are organizations and even Google searches and articles where you can read more about what to do. I'm trying to think. Another thing, also to Rashida's point, just about voting, League of Women Voters, vote411.com. It's so important to know, like right this year, it's going to be most likely mail by ballot. It's going to be a mail by ballot, overwhelmingly mail by ballot election. So finding out the right dates, finding out that, or if you do want to go in person, what does that look like? The information is there. It's good to look at it now so you're not scrambling last minute. And not just for this election, any election. It's so important to vote in every local election. New Jersey is one of the weirdo states, I think maybe the only state that has an election every year, right? So there's always something happening, and your municipal stuff is extremely important. I always tell people that people do not show up to vote for municipal elections, which is sad because those things really impact your day-to-day life. So getting involved in your local community is even during COVID, voting, we're still going to be voting. The internet's still available. You can still join these Zoom calls. It's all still there. So it's important to not just engage the one time, but keep engaging and growing your knowledge, as Rashida said.
Well, thank you, Nadia. And Deb, would you like to share what you would suggest by way of educational material or ways we can educate ourselves?
So I've been very interested in working on myself over the past year or more. And one of the things that I have done is I have taken a number of the Harvard implicit bias tests. So Harvard University, I'm going to share the website with everybody right now. If I can get it. Oh, yeah, I think it just attached to my note about the census, but it's implicit.harvard.edu. So these Harvard researchers put together these tests, and they're all online, and they cover a range of things. You can take a test about race or about sexual orientation, gender identity. I think even about diet preferences. They're all over the place. But when you walk into a circumstance and you say, I don't have any biases, you're lying. And if you walk into a place and you say, I'm going to try not to have any biases, you're fooling yourself. And I've tried to recognize that in myself because I've spent a lot of my professional career trying to teach my peers about issues concerning the LGBT community. And I've always thought that I was at least more perceptive to these issues, but biases are not necessarily bad because sometimes they keep us safe. They give us experience. They're built out of our own experiences. And so we have to try to figure out what are good biases and what are bad biases and how to figure that out. So the Harvard tests, if you do them and you don't like the outcome, your first experience is going to be, well, the test has to suck. But these are really good tests, and I'll tell you why. I was talking with a friend of mine who lives out in San Francisco, who is like me, a white Jewish lesbian, very shared experiences between the two of us. And she took the Harvard test on race, and she said she was so depressed because it came out, her result was that she had an awful lot of bias in respect to the differences between white people and black people. And she was very upset because this was not her view of herself. And so she spent about a year afterwards telling herself, if I'm going to read a book, it's going to be a book by a black author. If I'm going to watch a film, it's going to be a film about black folks. I'm going to try my best to immerse myself in seeing and reading about more experiences that black people in America have. And she did that, and I believe her because she's an awfully focused person. And when she went back and did the Harvard test, her test scores had miraculously changed. Same test, same person, just a different immersion of visuals and experiential understanding. And so I really suggest you look at it. I understood my tests at the end, my test scores. I understood where I understood why I may have been modestly biased against a particular community or more biased than I thought I was. When I looked back at it and I thought, because it's not part of my day-to-day experience. I'm working on subconscious biases or things that I may have learned a long time ago that I haven't shed yet. So I really suggest people work on themselves. We're all stuck at home. It's a good time to work on yourself.
Deb, you may have just answered my next question. I'll frame it a little differently than you framed your answer, and you can take another stab at this if you have other ways that you would answer this. How might we add the strand of diversity into the tapestry of our everyday lives?
I think the other thing that I've tried to do is pay attention to all of those talking heads on television, because a lot of them, a lot of watching the news, if you're watching responsibly, and if the newscasts are responsible, I think are going to give people great exposure to writers, to thought leaders, and community activists who they may never have known about before. You know, in my house, my partner and I spend an awful lot of time just with MSNBC on the television. We're not always paying attention, but I've seen and gotten familiar with so many, particularly younger people, who are so much at the forefront of all of the movements that we're talking about today. And it gives you an opportunity to get to know them a little and look at their work and look at their writing. Just that exposure is really important. And I think if we have kids in our lives, getting them exposed to the news, that's real responsible news, is really important. I grew up in a family that we sat down, we had dinner, and then we watched the news together. And I don't think we do that as families anymore. And I think that that is a real disadvantage for young people, not to be able to digest all the things that are going on out there with the assistance of our parents. They're getting their news from weird sources, from bad sources, maybe some from good. But if they're not getting our guidance as adults, I think that's really difficult. And my learned experience and the way I feel so strongly about that is because I grew up during the Vietnam War, and every single night there were bloody scenes all over the news. And if I had not had my parents there to digest that, to process that, I don't know what I would have thought I was watching. I think it would have been more destructive in a way than it was.
Thank you, Deb. Nadia, how would you suggest we might add the strand of diversity to the tapestry of our everyday lives?
Similar to Deb's friend, one thing we can all do is read authors who write about their experience, come from different backgrounds and diverse backgrounds. Once you start looking into different spaces such as books and media, you start seeing how mainstream wise, and even there's statistics backing it up, voices of communities of color really aren't uplifted. That's not the majority. That's not who makes up the majority of authors that are published. They're not the majority of movies that are funded and produced. So even some things we can do is that doesn't mean that they're not there. There's of course incredible writers from lots of different backgrounds that we can read, not just internationally, but sharing their let's say hyphenated American experience. Reading, if you have time and you are already reading and you love reading, you can definitely check out some of these authors. But even media, recently movies like Moonlight and Get Out and Us and even like Black Panther, for example, Fruitvale Station, and some of these movies have made it more into the mainstream, and they're amazing movies. But I think it's important to try to check out some of these movies. The last, A Black Man in San Francisco, I think it was a white director, but the writer and actor was a Black man, and it's a very powerful film. So there are also just media you can consume, right? That can come from diverse places, and you can prioritize taking in that media and making it part of your tapestry as you're doing this work yourself. Another thing is, as somebody who's a parent, I have a 5-year-old and a 4-month-old, there's this really wonderful platform and organization called Embrace Race. It's one word. You can Google them, but they're on Facebook as well. They're on Twitter. And they're actually a resource for parents to talk about race. And now that we're in COVID, they've actually incorporated that into the environment of COVID as well. They have Zoom calls, they have resources, they have wonderful book lists even children's books, for example, don't always have the diverse voices, or the character always looks a certain way, or the character is always a boy, it's never a girl. I mean, so what's wonderful now is that there are resources out there for parents, and also awareness that parents have or caretakers have, that, yeah, you're right, all the characters do look this way, or there is some stereotyping happening. Well, I don't want that. That's not what I want to ingrain in the children I'm taking care of. So those lists are available. So I'm just going to uplift Embrace Race as one place to go. But even, again, the internet, Googling, you can find some great resources for books such as this. But I think that, to me, is a great starting point.
Thank you, Nadia. And Rashida, how would you answer that question?
No, I think Deb and Nadia definitely had some great points. And I think to Nadia's point, and I want to thank you for the clarity, is that social media for me is definitely kind of the quickest way, but with social media, there's a level of responsibility and making sure that you understand, number one, people's agenda when they're posting. Who are they? What's their theme? What's been the history of kind of how they post, and not just in kind of social media, but like if they've written articles, like who are these people that we're supporting? Because I think it's really, you have kind of clout chasers, for lack of a better term, that might ride bandwagons or just post things, but they're not truly ingrained or invested in kind of the messaging. I think that Amazon has done, a great job. I'd say Amazon, and then also Netflix, I think, with the murder of George Floyd, really went to activism to kind of post separate like places or highlight separate places where you could specifically find Black movies. So I think I saw in the chat, someone mentioned, When They See Us. I've also, HBO just had the first episode of Lovecraft Country, which I think is brilliantly written. Watchmen. But then also just watching, again, stories that are outside of your community. So I just finished watching The Indian Matchmaker, which I thought was brilliantly written, just given the balance of kind of the Southeast Asian, Indian culture, and then American culture, and kind of the whole process of kind of matrimony and families. And so I think it gave me a really unique kind of perspective and just modern day view of kind of what that experience is like. And so watching, again, things about people that might not look like you specifically. But I think literature is really important. I think regardless of what you see, I wrote down a number of things just in this conversation, and just some of the things that I see in the chat that, part of my day outside of balancing out what I watch in social media is to dig deep, and that's the research part of me, and to find articles. Like I've written or read articles that go back, almost 100 years as to how, women's empowerment and, even women's suffrage and what the Black experience was like for women. There's just like Miss America, I think or Mrs. America, I think, which is now, I think, on Netflix or Amazon. But even a lot of this historical or these period pieces, whether it be like, based on a movie or a television series via streaming, really give you the context and names of people to kind of research and go back and find out who they were, what their lives were, what the true story, because everything we're getting via streaming or social media is in consumable bites. So it's meant to be dramatic, to be enticing, but it's important to really, I think, get back to like kind of the true story, and that really comes down to literacy and reading.
Great stuff. Thank you, Rashida. Folks, we have come to the end of our hour, and at least a couple of the panelists mentioned how important it is to admit when we've been wrong or we've made a mistake. And I must admit to you that while I was doing my prepared introduction, my phone rang and I got distracted, and I forgot to share with you something I wanted to share, a quote by Ani DeFranco, who says, "I know there is strength in the differences between us. I know there is comfort where we overlap." My hope is that through these conversations this evening, and later as we engage in similar conversations offline, is that we have found and will continue to find not only comfort in the places where we overlap, but also allies around the issues that matter to us. My sincere thanks to Deborah, Rashida, and Nadia for your participation in this important conversation, to the Junior League of Bergen County for hosting this event, and to all who have joined us this evening. May each of us continue these conversations in our homes and in our communities. And may we honor the rich diversity in our midst, which we rightly value, by becoming true allies where there is still work to be done. I believe Britt now has some concluding remarks.
Yeah, I just wanted to say Thank you, Deborah, Nadia, and Rashida, for your thoughtful insights on diversity, inclusion, unity, and allyship. You've given us plenty to think about and lots of great resources. And thank you, Bruce, for serving as the evening's moderator. We hope everyone enjoyed the discussion and that we can all find ways to apply some of these ideas about allyship into our daily lives. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and enjoys the rest of your week. Good night.